In this week's news roundup, the Boris Johnson government grapples with the consequences of its apparent incompetence in the fallout over sleaze. The Biden administration grapples with the consequences of Democrats' political radicalism in the wake of this week's elections, and the COP26 conference actually surprises all of us by achieving more, on paper at least, than we expected. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. Boris Johnson's government scored a breathtaking own goal this week, the likes of which seems to defy all hyperbole. The quick preamble. A Conservative MP and former Cabinet Minister Owen Paterson had been investigated by the independent process, the Parliamentary Standards Committee, established to hold whether MPs have broken the rules. And it was found that he had broke lobbying rules, taking money from two companies and then arguing for changes that would benefit those companies. He claimed, and continues to maintain, that he operated within the rules and did nothing wrong. He faced a 6-week suspension. Generally, in such cases, the report of the Oversight Committee would simply be accepted. But this time, the government decided to step in. It proposed to pause Paterson's case and to set up a new parliamentary committee to establish an appeals body that could then hear his case. That committee would be dominated by Conservative MPs, which many described as the Conservatives marking their own homework. Needless to say, the opposition parties declared that they would not take part in such a committee under any circumstances. At first glance, this all looks like an incredibly stupid thing to do, guaranteed to unite the media and public in accusations of sleaze and government changing the rules to protect its own. However, with longer, more careful reflection, yep, it still looks like an incredibly stupid thing to do. And indeed, it united the media and the public in accusations of sleaze. Worse for the government is that it decided this vote would be a 3-line whip, meaning that the party tells its MPs that they must vote for it, like it or not. In spite of that, 13 Tories opposed it, 38 others abstained. Many others voted for it under protest. Now, when a group of people does something that looks bad, that they must have known would look bad, and they do it anyway, I think you should try to take the time to work out what was the rationale. Was there a good reason that the headlines are missing? People's true motives are rarely the cartoon-level bad guy stuff that their opponents ascribe to them. Sometimes you actually do have to do stuff in politics that you know is going to be misrepresented, but it's the right thing to do regardless, and you just have to take the hit. Now, of course, there are also times when politicians are just so blinded by their own venality and out of touch with the population that they become divorced from reality. Both these things are possible, so it bears a careful look, not just jumping to obvious conclusions. And from reading some of the supportive comments and discussions, it does seem as though there are a couple of things that were in play. One, the head of the Standards Committee process, Catherine Stone, who was appointed by the combative anti-Brexit former Speaker John Bercow, was felt by the Conservatives to be pursuing them in an excessive and biased way. Paterson's friend Charles Moore, writing 5 days previously, described how the Paterson investigation went down. And he said this: exactly 2 years ago today, Ms. Stone began to investigate Mr. Paterson. She has no legal training, and it showed. It took her more than a year to speak to him. She did not tell him the scope of her investigation. When he answered her questions by email, she never engaged with his replies, but simply fired off more. Until she gave him her draft report in December 2020, she had never let him know her case against him. She later admitted to the committee, "I had decided Mr. Paterson had breached the rules by the time I had sent him my first memorandum. In approaching the matter in this way, it was she who breached the rules, the basic rules of natural justice." Now, that does sound persuasive. It's worth noting that the chair of the Oversight Committee, the Labour MP Chris Bryant, has insisted that Paterson had indeed been treated fairly. So that's one. And two, there's also an added sympathy factor with him because, reportedly partly because of the pressure of the investigation, his wife had committed suicide. Obviously a terrible personal tragedy, and something that made even some of those who believed that he had acted wrongly to feel that he deserved some degree of leniency. So that explains the motivation. It doesn't in any way suggest that how the government went about acting was well judged. Any sensible outsider would have concluded that you needed to separate out the specific individual case from the longer term question of system reform. Otherwise, it just looks like you're prepared to fix the system purely in order to get the result that you want, which is incredibly destructive of any sort of trust that there might be in that system. I mean, that should be bleeding obvious. And so it turned out, just hours after instructing MPs to vote for the measure, just hours after saying that even if it provoked opprobrium, it was the right thing to do, the government performed a prompt and humiliating U-turn. Instead, the Johnson government announced that no new process would now go ahead without cross-party support, and also that there would be another vote at the earliest possible opportunity on Owen Paterson's fate. Owen Paterson responded by announcing that he was resigning as a Member of Parliament as he'd had enough. He'd been denied a chance to clear his name. The opposition will continue to make the most of what they can out of accusations of sleaze on the part of the government. This will have fuel added to its fire by the fact that Boris Johnson's former advisor Dominic Cummings suggested that the real reason for the move to change the rules was because Boris Johnson wanted to head off any inquiry about what he said was Johnson's illegal donations, using Paterson as the cover to do this. Some in government apparently tried to make a virtue out of a U-turn, saying that it's better to correct a mistake promptly when you make it. Now, that's a principle that I personally agree with, but according to Andrew MacDonald of Politico, this is the 36th U-turn the government has made in 23 months. It's hard not to see that figure as representing habitually poor judgment. By all accounts, and for whatever motive, this has been a remarkable 24 hours of complete shambles. And speaking of shambles, in the US, the Biden administration and the Democrats generally were left bruised and bloodied this week in the wake of the first round of midterm elections, specifically the triumph of Republican Glenn Youngkin in the Virginia governor race, with the result in New Jersey being a wafer-thin victory in a state that should have been a comfortable hold. The beauty and the power of democracy is that you get regularly and occasionally unambiguous feedback from the electorate that smart leaders will use to course correct if they need to. That does not seem to be what's happening here. Instead, even as the results were coming in, all sides were rehearsing their reasons why it was everyone else's fault, and what they needed to do in the future was more of what they wanted. President Biden insisted that it certainly wasn't his fault, and what people really wanted was for him to be successful at getting his program implemented. And he said this: people are upset and uncertain about a lot of things, from COVID to schools to jobs to a range of things, and the cost of a gallon of gasoline, and that's why I'm continuing to push very hard for the Democratic Party to move along and pass my infrastructure bill and my Build Back Better bill. It's true that polls suggest that there is generally reasonable support for those bills being negotiated, but you have to see that alongside the tanking of support for Biden himself, which seems based on more factors than just whether those bills get passed or not. The radical progressives were similarly clear that it wasn't their fault, and what was needed to improve was more radical progressivism. Oh yes. They said that neither Biden nor the Virginia candidate Terry McAuliffe were progressives, so blaming the progressives for the defeat was just wrong. They said the McAuliffe campaign had been milquetoast, and the election would have gone better if they'd had a black woman candidate, a reference to two of the primary candidates who lost out to McAuliffe. For some reason, they weren't celebrating the election of Winsome Sears, the successfully elected Republican candidate for Lieutenant Governor, who turned out to be that post's first black woman office holder. But in any case, can you really say that it's local factors, given that Democrats' poor performance wasn't limited to that one state? Democratic political strategist James Carville was asked what was to blame for his party's recent weakness at the polls, and he put it down to, quote, stupid wokeness. I mean, this defund the police lunacy, this take Abraham Lincoln's name off schools. I mean that people see that. It just really has a suppressive effect all across the country on Democrats. Some of these people need to go to a woke detox centre or something. They're expressing a language that people just don't use, and there's a backlash and a frustration at that. Indeed, in Virginia, a lot of the campaign publicity had been about the teaching of the principles behind critical race theory in schools, along with the pushing of trans ideology. The Democratic candidate McAuliffe had made the pretty disastrous comment that he didn't believe that parents should be telling schools what they should teach. Meanwhile, Glenn Youngkin was saying instead that he absolutely wanted parents to be heard and for children to be taught how to think, not what to think, and all of that stuff. It's surely no accident that white women in Virginia, both college educated but more so for non-college educated, switched in significant numbers from how they'd voted in the 2020 election. Pushing ideology on people's children is not how you win their votes, is the suggestion anyway. By the way, Nor is then reacting to the loss by calling them all racist, as some Democratic commentators did, nor indeed defunding the police in cities that are seeing rising violent crime. In Minneapolis, voters rejected a proposal to disband the city's police force and to replace it with a Department of Public Safety, which would have renamed police as peace officers. One progressive council member complained, "We have seen a backlash to progress in our city." Or maybe you just misunderstood what constitutes progress. I mean, that's always a possibility. But progressives have no inkling that this result may require them to back down, and Republicans seem to be remarkably happy about it as they look forward to 2022. As one election strategist put it, what are they thinking? Meanwhile, at the COP26 climate conference, it seems there might actually have been progress beyond what most of us expected. We'll come to that in just a minute. But first, glyphosate is one of the most widely used weed killers in the world. When something gets widely used, it's generally because it's useful and effective. We live in a world where producing high volumes of good quality food is essential, so this stuff matters. Also, when something gets widely used, you find out whether there are negative impacts to that sort of use being pushed to scale. Sometimes the price you have to pay for that benefit you get is too high a price. Sometimes we won't be sure of whether it is or not. There will always be those who urge caution and those who point to the value of the benefits and argue. This area of pesticides and herbicides is one that is fiercely contested. Most recently, a lawsuit in the US over whether glyphosate was responsible for someone's cancer was won by the company, Bayer. But it's the first of many, and who knows how most of them will go. It's an area where it can be hard to make sense of it all. The campaigners are so ideologically opposed to the chemical companies, their arguments can be full of motivated reasoning, but at the same time, those on the other side are major corporations who have extremely powerful financial incentives to gloss over problems and a pretty unsavoury history of doing just that. So what are you to make of all this, if you are neither of those two extremes and you would just like to know the truth? I will be beginning the journey at least of trying to make sense of it all in the video going live on this channel on Monday next week, 7 PM UK time. Join me for that. The COP26 conference has now moved on from a bit where all the top leaders turn up and make grand speeches to more of the detail and nitty-gritty, or the real work as it's known. Last week I commented that if you took the stated objectives of COP26 seriously, that it aimed to achieve commitments that would keep the world within 1.5 degrees C warming, that it would necessarily fail because of the non-engagement of China and Russia, if for no other reason. However, it has actually moved forward somewhat further than diminished expectations had expected. India's surprise announcement that it was committing to net zero by 2070, for all that there was predictable whining about the fact the date was later than some of the others, turned out to have more value than first thought. A review of the impact of all the pledges made previously and now at COP26 suggests that they would be sufficient to keep the planetary warming to around 1.8 degrees C, which is significantly reduced from the 2.7 that it was before. It requires all the pledges to be met in practice, of course. We can raise our eyebrows at the assumption that's going to happen without further effort, but it is nevertheless a sign that something in the scale of ambition is definitely shifting. Other material commitments have come. That included 105 world leaders agreeing a deal to cut methane emissions by 30% by the end of the decade. More than that would not be possible without the inclusion of China, India and Russia, 3 of the top methane emitters who have not signed. The other big measure was a declaration to end deforestation by 2030, and it was significant because the countries signing it have 85% of the world's forests, including Brazil, China and Russia, none of whom supported an earlier version back in 2014 that failed. Around 11% of global greenhouse gases are reported to come from deforestation and the loss of other ecosystems, so this stuff does matter. £14 billion is to be channeled into supporting activities in developing countries such as restoring degraded land and tackling wildfires. Jeff Bezos, founder of the other Amazon, pledged £2.2 billion towards the programme. Not everyone was persuaded. Greenpeace Brazil said that the reason Bolsonaro had been happy to sign the deal was that it allowed another decade of forest destruction. But they said the Amazon is already on the brink and can't survive more years of deforestation. One of the things that Joe Biden said at COP26 was that the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping had been wrong not to attend. To be fair, he probably felt he had rather a lot to deal with at home. Some were startled this week when Beijing sent out the message to its citizens urging them to stockpile foods. On the one hand, this reflected the shortage of basic necessities after the summer floods that destroyed significant numbers of crops. Vegetable prices have surged in recent months, particularly because the largest vegetable growing area, Shandong Province, endured a succession of extreme weather, including a tornado. Generally, when governments fear shortages, they do the opposite to encouraging stockpiling, because hoarding obviously makes any shortages that you have significantly worse. So unsurprisingly, the government pronouncement sparked confusion, reflected in more than 17 million comments on the topic on China's version of Twitter, Weibo. Some speculated it must signify that the government was preparing its people for an imminent attack on Taiwan. But really, it was probably simply reflecting a degree of alarm by the Chinese leadership that its society is sliding out of control. The high priority for China's leaders is social stability. And as Xi Jinping is about to push legislation through at the next Communist Party meeting next week, to secure his next 5 years in charge, it's not looking tremendously stable. Food shortages and high prices, ongoing energy crisis, looming collapse of the massively indebted property sector, and signs of more COVID surges that could get out of control. Now that last one is being used to explain the food stockpiling call. State media said that the government simply wanted citizens to be sufficiently stocked if they were forced to isolate for a period because of a COVID outbreak. Remember, China remains the last holdout for a zero COVID strategy, but reportedly the number of local cases has doubled in the last week across 14 different provinces, for all that it's still at relatively low levels. Another casualty of the government's focus on social stability is the tech companies, on whom the government has been cracking down over the last year. From their statements, it seems that they're trying to prevent what they see as the negative impact of the West's social media giants on society from infecting the Chinese equivalent. One recent casualty of that has been Yahoo, which finally gave up on China in the face of laws to limit foreign companies from accessing data on Chinese citizens. Xi Jinping has recently implemented personal information protection laws modelled on EU protections on privacy, but with the usual loophole that what applies to private companies doesn't apply to the state. But that's for new tech. The Pentagon also suggested this week that China is rapidly expanding another area of tech, namely nuclear weapons. In a report, it said that Beijing could have 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030 based on their current activity. Something to bear in mind, given their recent reported, but denied by the CCP, of a test of a hypersonic missile. Some brief summaries of the rest of the news. The Biden administration has announced that its employers' vaccine mandate law will go into effect on January the 4th. Under the rule, all employers with more than 100 employees will be required to confirm that their staff have either been vaccinated or have taken a weekly COVID test. Now, cases of COVID-19 have been falling across the US over recent weeks, and the start date is 2 months away, so it seems puzzling timing, shall we say. Not least because with this measure, the US, which prizes freedom so highly, seems poised to bring in one of the more authoritarian COVID vaccine mandates outside of China. Certain companies are gearing up to challenge the measure in court, since they feel fairly certain that it represents executive overreach and will not stand if challenged. Professor Carrie Bourassa, who was the Scientific Director for Indigenous People's Health at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, was found to have spun a story about being an Indigenous woman who therefore didn't think that she would ever get out of high school. It turns out that lying about your heritage can at least get you out of a job. Veldon Coburn, an Indigenous professor at the University of Ottawa, told the Times of London that some who faked Indigenous ancestry were trying to piggyback on equity programs, whereas others fetishise Indigenous people so much that they cosplay being Indigenous. Facebook has bowed to the growing chorus of attacks on their privacy issues by saying that it will stop using facial recognition technology for the photos and videos its users upload on its platform. This will involve deleting face scan data for more than 1 billion users. Facebook isn't the first. Microsoft and Amazon have paused facial recognition work, including partnerships with police forces. That news item I covered last week about Tesla's huge deal to provide 100,000 cars to rental company Hertz seems as though it may have been prematurely announced by the rental company. Elon Musk tweeted in direct contradiction of Hertz's claim that Tesla had not yet signed a deal with Hertz, a statement that promptly made Tesla's stock dip, just as the original one had made it rise. Hertz, meanwhile, said that its deliveries of Tesla cars to its rental fleet are already occurring. So something must have happened somewhere, you'd think. Musk said that in any case it didn't make sense for the stock to rise or to fall on such announcements because Tesla was constrained by its capacity at the moment, not by limited orders. In other words, they're getting cars out the door as fast as they physically can, and demand is higher than supply. If you watch popular political discourse for long enough, you should come to realise that we spend a lot less time thinking about events and issues, and rather more just reviving and swapping cliches. The COP26 conference has highlighted this perfectly well, as just about every similar conference and report always does. We've heard this is the last best chance to save the world. Now, since that was said about the previous conference and then the one before that and all the ones going back 20 years ago, you should reflect on whether it's even a useful thing to say. Indeed, if it turned out to be true this year, say, the fact that it was said all those previous years probably means it carries a lot less weight than it probably should do. The boy who cried wolf and all that. Now, of course, the people who trade cliches on the other side would like to pretend that these are predictions of doom, which only very occasionally someone who's really clumsy with their cliches, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, will actually validate. The truth is that a little while ago it probably was true, in that the report had said that keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees C was highly desirable to prevent the more serious impacts, and several years ago was probably the last realistic moment to achieve that goal. We are now past that goal. Plenty quietly admit it, others see such talk as defeatism and will fight it. But with that definition, it didn't mean that the world ended the next day, just that a certain amount of change in the medium term becomes inevitable. The problem with the cliche is that the way people talked about it and talked it up, it encouraged those who can only think in cliches to believe that if you hit 1.5 degrees, you then fell off a cliff. But you don't. So right now, any opportunity we get to take solid action will be by definition a better time than all of the later ones, because 1.6 is better than 1.7 and so on. And that means we're going to hear the cliche over and over again. It doesn't motivate action, but it's the only thing that people know what to say. Likewise, the generational divide tropes. Likewise, the hypocrisy of foreign leaders flying to climate conference tropes. All of them are cliches, trotted out over and over again to diminishing effect. Each side has their preferred cliches, they trot them out, slap each other around with them in lieu of having any sort of useful conversation. And you'll see it in the YouTube comments section as well. It's the difference between the comments that seem to be specifically responding to something that was said in a video versus those you imagine they would have written under every single video on any related topic, probably without even watching it. I note that social media encourages this. Playing into the cliches provides the best clickbait, whether indeed for the mainstream media or for YouTube. I remain of the view that we should nevertheless aspire to something rather more specific to the situation that we find ourselves in. And my very safe prediction is that I will be making the same point at the very next COP conference and the one after that, because they'll be trading all the same cliches over and over again. Indeed, at some point, maybe my saying this will become my very own cliche, which I can utilise without thinking. At which point, I can change the channel slogan to, I don't know, dangerously predictable or something. All right. Well, the most predictable part, you might say, is that I will go on next to thank the people who support this channel on Patreon. And indeed, you would be right. Predictable it may be, but some things repeat because they are centrally important. And in this case, because the other sadly predictable thing is that the channel continues not to be promoted to non-subscribers by YouTube since the algorithm was tweaked back in March. And I simply couldn't put the time into making these videos and working to break through those barriers without that support. Not only does it provide funding for that, but it's also the added motivation as well. Having a core of people who are committed to seeing you succeed. I am grateful for all of that, more than you could possibly know. If you would like to add your support to the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please go along to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.